back for a marathon session. We're going to June 6, 1935. I'm Loren Schoenberg, and my two guests here are my two friends, drummer Hal Smith from Arkansas, or coming to us from Arkansas. These guys play all over the place. Nick Rossi, coming to us from San Francisco. Nick plays the guitar, Hal plays the drums, I play the saxophone, and all three of us are not only instrumentalists, but historians who are very much into the era and the context. And so we've been listening to these recordings, the Goodman recordings, going back to the first music hall records from 1934, session by session. And now we're going to a marathon recording date that was done on June 6, 1935. Russ Connor, the author of the indispensable Goodman bio discographies, has written about it at length. I'll just summarize what he wrote. And he said that basically the band went in, they did 51 tunes in one day. They received $1 per tune. There were no second takes. And the personnel actually was never really captured, but it was guessed at. Well, I mean, they knew who was on the Victor dates, and they played the records. Russ played the records for Benny and Gene Krupa and Pee Wee Irwin and others, and they came up with a relatively reasonable personnel, which you'll see as we listen to the first track. So let's go to the music. This is Makin' Whoopee.
Well, there it is, the first guitar solo we've heard on any session so far.
Yeah.
So yeah, unquestionably that's Alan Roos in the rhythm section, and it's interesting. The balance is very similar, at least in the section, to what we heard on the last session. Although you can hear Gene a little more this time around, which I think is a good thing. I mean, as much as I enjoyed hearing Alan very clearly last time, I think there's still a little bit of a balance that these records can benefit from. Real quick, I'll talk about the approach to a solo that Alan takes. It's what's been termed now as a chord melody style guitar solo, in which most of us in contemporary terms are used to hearing a guitar solo that's made up of single notes and more of a melodic line or riff based, et cetera, et cetera. The guitar players of this era developed a way to play solo breaks by playing chords, often strung together with single notes, kind of much more like a piano would play, or a chordal piano would play. So this is a great example of Alan really just having such tremendous technique and having some great ideas at a pretty young age and really early in his recording career. He would later develop these chordal ideas and approaches to a real great degree. You can hear him 10 years later in a lot of mid-40s sessions that he really just kind of takes it to its limit, if you will. But it's great to hear, and it's for a guitar player, it's thrilling to get a little taste of what Alan was capable of.
How old is he here?
He was born in 1915, I think June. So this is right around his 20th birthday.
20?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just worth, thinking about for a moment, because like you said in the previous show that we just did, the previous session, Benny Goodman wasn't Benny Goodman yet. So nobody knew what was going to happen. But nonetheless, these were, for the most part, fabled studio players and virtuosi and guys who had been on a million record dates for the most part, or were on their way to doing that. Some had sterling jazz reputations like Goodman and Krupa, and a handful of them. But I mean, he was 19, I guess, on the last record date or something.
Yeah.
And
yes.
Here he is just turning 20. That's really something. I mean, yeah. I think here we're kind of hearing the band actually in a different fashion than on the Victor session, although they were distant on that last Victor session, strangely so. This sounds to me like pretty much a mic, or at the best two, just in front of a band and go play. And then Roos would come up, I guess, for his solo or something like that. And I kind of like it, because then we really get to hear what Gene and them are doing. Maybe like, if we actually went to hear them, not how they played on a record date, but for a whole night in a ballroom. What did you hear, Hal? What news?
I heard quite a bit of Chick Webb influence on that. If you've listened to all the commercial Chick Webb recordings and the broadcasts and the transcriptions, that's when you hear the things that didn't always come through on the records. The cymbal crashes in certain places, playing on the stem of the hi-hat, which was quite prominent on that recording. The rim shot accents and the way he played the hi-hat with the accent on the second and fourth beat, as opposed to the way Joe Jones would play it a little bit later, where there's more of an even 4/4 feel to it. But the most interesting part of that was the playing on the stem of the hi-hat. Back in this era, the drummers who were using hi-hats, they were generally very small and thin, made to support small and thin cymbals. And drummers weren't playing hard all the way through a song on them. And the stems were hollow. So you've got a nice high-pitched ring to it. Eventually that disappeared as drummers started playing harder and put bigger cymbals on. They had to beef up the construction of the stands. But this is when they're still kind of in their infancy, really. And he got a real good one there. That had a nice ringing tone to it.
I have a question for you, a double-barrel question. First is, if you could take us through the evolution of that hi-hat cymbal from the low boy, and I know, oh boy, I know this is something, man, you could do it, because you've done it with me, and it's fascinating. You could talk for hours about that. But, if you could take us through the evolution of the hi-hat cymbal. And also, if I remember correctly, I've seen these films of the young Buddy Rich, where he's playing under... When he's playing the hi-hat, he's not playing it over his left arm. He's playing it under, I guess. And
right.
Was that something that Gene did too at that time?
Yes, he did. I've seen early photos of him playing the hi-hat where he put his right hand under the left arm to play the hi-hat and was playing the snare drum above. very difficult way to do it. I've tried that, and I thought, what were those guys thinking?
Yeah.
It's really easy to hit your wrist together and drop everything if you make just a slightly wrong move. And that's probably what he was doing on this session, because he hadn't changed around yet. But back to your question about the hat, the original design was called a snowshoe, and it went side to side and didn't ring, didn't put out a whole lot of rhythm. There was another one that was just big enough, just like a house shoe. You put your dress shoe into it, and it would either go up and down or side to side. And there's the low boy, which is the prototype of the hi-hat, where the cymbals went up and down. And I've heard, as we've discussed before, 3 different people claim to have invented the actual hi-hat as we know it. One was Kaiser Marshall from Fletcher Henderson's band, Ben Pollock, great Chicago drummer, and Vic Burton, another great Chicago drummer who played with Paul Whiteman and Vic Spiderbeck, Red Nichols, everybody you can think of. I happen to think it came about independently. Somebody got tired of trying to reach down and play on the low boy, and they said, why don't I put a pipe on this thing and raise it up high enough that I can actually hit it? And so I think that was invented independently, but it wasn't really used as a timekeeping device until the very early 30s, when Walter Johnson would use it with Fletcher Henderson. Those are the first hi-hat records I've heard, where it's obviously not a stick under a cymbal or some other kind of contraption, but something operated with a pedal with the drummer playing stick on 2 cymbals moving up and down. 1930, 30 and 31 are where you begin to hear it, and it's used as a spice, sometimes just in the middle of a tune or on the last few bars of a chorus, but not all the way through as a major timekeeping device.
I think there may be one on Henderson's Chinatown, or
Yes.
on some of those records. There's little
That's right.
sounds there. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Boy, something else I would love to ask you about. I'm going to just put it on the side here. Maybe we can talk about it when it comes up later. With early jazz drums, is that, have you seen that Vitaphone short with Norman Thomas Quintet with the show drummer guy?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right. Who, which kind of helps me understand, like, Lionel Hampton as a drummer and a lot of this stuff, that kind of show drumming with getting up and down and playing on the front of the drums and all that. But anyway, I don't know why I mentioned that, because I don't want to get into it now. But just at some point, I would love to watch that with you and get your take on it, because I think it's probably, well, without a doubt, it's the first extended shots of a jazz drum set and somebody playing a solo on them, right? 1929. I mean,
long
Freddie, solo.
That's
Freddie Crump?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You're right.
So I'd love to talk about that with you sometime. Let's go to the second session from the Thesaurus makers, the Rhythm Makers Orchestra. This is Poor Butterfly. Interesting. Clearly, stock arrangement or a stockish arrangement. Far less interesting than most of what the Goodman Band recorded in terms of voicings and orchestration and counterpoint and things like that. But nonetheless, a perfectly respectable chart with good changes and good melody and great moments from the rhythm section. I mean, especially when Benny came in, it was really, really exciting. One of the reasons that people thought that it was Bunny Berrigan on these sessions is because Pee Wee Irwin could really sound like Bunny Berrigan. And they were really, I mean, Bunny had already been in the Goodman Band and had been drinking and stuff. And Pee Wee Irwin came in, they were already going back and forth, but that's Pee Wee Irwin. So I'll just get out of the way by saying, what did I love about that record? The beautiful blend of the sections, the precision of the playing. I mean, just all the things you would take for granted with a band like that. The intonation, the attack, the cutoffs, the blend. And when Benny comes in, regardless of the context, it becomes a jazz record, whatever the heck that means. But it really does. I mean, there's something to listen to and something to learn on all these records. And someone take me to the rhythm section.
Well, you know what struck me was just how the rhythm section didn't really change too much from the last record. And what I mean by that, they still treated it as you know, a Benny Goodman chart, even though it's possibly a stock, you know, arguably a commercial treatment of a commercial song, right? We talked about in the last session. But there's a lot of subtle rhythmic variances going all throughout that song that you know, you would think that the band of just months earlier with Van Epps, and I say this in the utmost respect, might have just laid back and played it a little more politely and a little bit more like maybe a hotel band or a dance, you know, a typical dance band would. But you can hear, especially in Alan Roos, you can hear his bouncing back and forth between that backbeat as well as playing straight quarter notes, and kind of, you know, coming up with slightly different patterns throughout the song. You also, once again, hear him voicing chords pretty high up the neck and using that that high E string, which, like I said earlier, you know, he would abandon by the end of the 30s, more or less, for this type of playing. And plus, Poor Butterflies is one of my favorite tunes to listen to Benny play. I mean, I could listen to Benny soloing over this tune any day of the week.
Yeah, and he famously made a sextet record with Charlie Christian, and it remained in his repertoire for many years. So this is probably the first version that he did. Just real quick, when you say how he changed up his patterns, what does that mean?
Well, for example, I was noticing he was early on in the record. He would play a bar of emphasizing the 2 and the 4, playing that backbeat, and then the next bar he would play it straight and play it, you know, each quarter note with even time. And he did that for the A sections, kind of under the melody, that entire first time around, which is kind of interesting because it's usually you either play backbeat for the chorus or you play straight for the chorus, the bridge, or whatever. But he was alternating between the two for a sustained period of time. And it sounded like there was a method to his kind of, you know, madness, if you will.
What also, and this is something that, you know, that I encounter with young bands, let's say pretty much any big band from 1960 on, but high school bands and college bands playing the older music, there's a total misunderstanding of what the rhythm guitar is, the fact that, you know, 1 note or 2 note or 3 notes, and they just sit there sometimes just playing 5-note chords or whatever is going bring, bring, bring. Yeah. What is Alan Roos doing here? Without getting too technical about it, but I mean, you know, if it's an A-flat 6 chord or whatever, I mean, is he voicing it just like in a closed voicing, like you played on the piano, just like this, or is he moving it, or
there's definitely some movement? Well, you know, he's picking up that concept we talked about in a couple episodes ago that Van Epps came up with, which is, you know, a guitar, you have the opportunity to play 6 notes in a chord, but 2, possibly 3 of those notes are redundant. They're octaves. So what Van Epps did was pare it down to play, you know, usually root 3rd and 5th as the core, but then, you know, adding 6ths, adding 7ths where appropriate. Although oftentimes rhythm guitar players from this era would leave the music to the piano or the arrangement. but you're not, most importantly, you're not playing octaves in your chord, which in George's mind kind of muddied up the sound of the chord. And this is, it was less apparent in what we heard from George on these Goodman records, and it's much more explicit on these Alan Roos appearances, how that helps that chord cut through the rest of the musical information that the band's transmitting. So they tend to also be voiced a little bit higher up the neck, so less of a dependence on the bass strings, kind of in the mid-range of the guitar, leaning towards the upper end of the guitar.
Hal, I'd like to ask you what we heard from Gene there, but also if you also want to go off on the same kind of tangent about the drum set and maybe how differently people approached playing a drum set on a tune like that back then, as they do now, kind of similar to what I was talking about with Nick, you know, how young players probably have really no idea about how people approach the set, or maybe they do. I'll leave it open for you to tell us. But
well, one very valuable thing to me on that recording was listening to Gene Krupa match the 4/4 and the 2/4 with what Alan Roos was playing. When Alan Roos was accenting the second and fourth beat, so did Gene on the brushes, and not too loud, just accenting it, just going along with what was going on at the time. And also, I think he kind of allowed Harry Goodman to dominate that particular performance. The bass, to me, that was the loudest part of the rhythm section, except for the cymbals at the end. But what a nice blend. Yeah. And you can get that when you play drums if you lift the sound out. When you strike a cymbal or strike a drum, you don't just let the stick or the brush fall onto the drum. You hit it a glancing blow. You lift the sound out. And that's what I hear Gene Krupa doing all through that performance.
Fascinating.
You know, one thing I noticed about this performance from Gene, Al, and Loren is that, you know, I think Gene kind of unfairly, just because of the historical lens that he tends to be viewed through, isn't seen as subtle of a drummer as some of his contemporaries. And I think what we've heard last couple sides, as well as the last session for that matter, you know, he had a pretty wide dynamic range, which I think, you know, often sometimes gets swept under the rug for all of his, you know, gum chewing, tousled haired, you know, excitement.
Line and potatoes and pork chops. I'm sorry.
But that's, you know, that's when you talk about again, like what contemporary big bands can take from these records. You know, one thing is just the amount of dynamics that these musicians imbued into their performance, and regardless of the instrument, you know, that the drums don't need to be, you know, beaten, you know, hit really hard, even though there's 12, 13, 14 other people in the room with you. There's ways to coax some interesting sounds out of it and fulfill your role in the band and continue to make good music. And I think that's one of the great lessons that all of these records from this era can help show.
Loren, to address what you asked me about the drum set itself, there's no way for me to tell orally if that's Krupa's own set or if that was a studio set, but I would be willing to bet that's his snare drum and his cymbals. And in that era, I think those are the two key elements to playing a session like this, because most of the timekeeping was still on the snare drum or on the cymbal, either choked or playing an open crash or with a stick underneath to simulate a hi-hat, and of course the hi-hats themselves. But he played for the band in this era. There's no question about that. He started with brushes. Maybe that was him playing that chime at the beginning too. And if it was, what perfect timing. He just nailed it right exactly when the rest of the band played. But he started on brushes. He's listening to Alan Roos to match the 2-beat and 4-beat feel. Then he switched to press rolls to increase the excitement towards the end, and he caught all of the hits that the horns played. Yes. On obviously those were arranged. That's not yes. just something that he thought of himself, but he was definitely playing for the band to speak to those who say he played too much and got in the way and played too loud. He sure didn't on this session.
I have a feeling that really, and we'll get into this eventually, that, you know, up through when Harry James comes in the band, he's playing one way. Well, actually, I mean, let's put it this way. He always played the Gene Krupa way. And so as soon as you get into this, you know, let's take a couple things for granted. He's a master. He's an original. He was influential. No one else did what he did, and he didn't do what other people did. But I mean, that's all taken for granted. But I think there's a point at which he puts himself out sometimes in front of the band, or what his opinion is kind of equally important as the band's. And that's why he was right to go get his own band. Obviously, you know. But that's far in the future. But anyway, he's just so wonderful on these records. And one thing I love about Gene is, and I'm sure how you've been hearing this for years, being a drummer yourself, is to all the young drummers, how beautiful he was. Going back to the 30s. I mean, Mel Lewis used to talk about how he met him, you know, when Mel was 8 or 6 or 5 or something like that. And that's just one of a gazillion drummers, who just loved this guy. He was a beautiful, warm person, supportive, and wonderful in many ways. I think
nothing
I was
negative.
Oh, not only negative, but very positive.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
No. I was going to. Maybe I'll lead off with it on the next session. I'll share the brief story about the couple times I saw Gene Krupa, and a particularly moving story that was no more than just dumb luck on my part.
Wow.
But anyway, we'll get back to the music, and we'll hear "Ballad in Blue," the beautiful piece that they will record later that month for the famous Victor recording. That, according to the discography, it says George Van Eps is back for one session, which is interesting. So we'll listen to it and see how we hear that. But anyway, Spud Murphy's "Ballad in Blue."
how about that? It started in 4/4, and it stayed in 4/4 pretty much all the way through. That's kind of unusual for any jazz band of that era except Duke Ellington. And
Yes.
the whole mood of that reminded me of Duke Ellington.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that's keyed on the string bass playing in 4. And Gene Krupa sounded a little bit like Sonny Greer there, just playing quiet time on press rolls and occasional cymbal crash. That's more of a mood piece than a dance band piece or a jazz piece. But what a wonderful sound in the rhythm section.
Yeah, it's a tune by Hoagie Carmichael, and a beautiful classic arrangement by Spud Murphy with those beautiful saxophone things, and just gorgeous. And you kind of hear the band's, for lack of a better word, naked balance. In other words, there's no fancy miking going on. There's nothing. I mean, that's just how they sounded. And the band, what a beautiful blend. But I did hear some incredible moments from Mr. Roos.
Oh, boy.
Well, we heard Alan building on something that we heard a little kind of taste of, a teaser of on a couple of George Van Epp's performances, which were these arpeggiated chords. So, playing chord forms, but sounding out individual notes in the chord forms to either lead into the full chord or lead into another chord. And we heard it all throughout this performance. And it's again, like it's a great example of what a rhythm guitarist can do. He's still in time, keeping time, but he's able to embellish in ways that don't detract from the time, don't prevent him from fulfilling his job, his role within the dance orchestra, within the jazz orchestra. And in a lot of ways, he's taking the Van Epp's concept already now to the next level. I mean, it's as much of an admirer of George Van Epp's that I am, and in many ways respect him a little bit more for being the originator of this technique and this approach. The case can be argued pretty well that Alan took it to its kind of ultimate, if you will. And he would later do that with some of his recordings in the late 30s, and certainly his recordings in the mid 40s. But this is a little kind of hint of what we've seen before, and a taste of how Alan would develop his technique over the next few years.
I know, in the Goodman band, he has little 8-bar bridges here and there. And I guess on broadcasts, depending on where the mic was, sometimes you can really hear him, like on Goodbye. I think there's some versions of Goodbye where he does some pretty fancy stuff. But I guess people would have known him in the big band era, for that record he made with Jack Teagarden, Picking with Patsy, or...
Yeah, Picking for Patsy.
Yeah, right. And that's probably pretty much, if you were an Alan Roos fan, well, I guess those... and the Hampton sessions, because he actually does get some great moments on the Hampton sessions.
Yeah, he definitely gets to stretch out most on those Hampton sessions. He gets those kind of chord melody breaks, and Alan was kind of the master of stringing together these chords with single note lines, which is part of that approach and that technique. So yeah, it's definitely those Lionel Hampton sessions. Yeah. Again, to kind of fast forward, he's just amazing on some mid 40s sessions with people like Benny Carter. We talked about the Coleman Hawkins session before as well. It's clear that he continued developing this approach and this technique, even well beyond the era that we're talking about right now.
Yeah. And I also just want to mention two of the Teddy Wilson and his orchestra dates with the Goodman guys in 36 and 37 done out in California. There's some marvelous moments in there too. But
there's a great version of Coquette that's mine that's got some great Alan Roos on it.
Yeah. I should mention that the Teddy Wilson sides are on a Teddy Wilson Mosaic box set. And the Lionel Hampton sides are also on a Mosaic box set of all the Hampton stuff too. And so, those things were mastered. They're available, but now everything's all over the place. You never know where to get things. Plus, on YouTube and various other places, you can listen to these recordings. And one thing I like about, and I have really mixed feelings about YouTube. It's such a great resource. This interview hopefully will be up on YouTube, and I'm sure we both play on records that are on YouTube, for people to listen to. But it's a mixed blessing. It's like the two women who met on Broadway one day. And they say, "Oh, that's a beautiful ring you have." She says, "Yes, but it came with the Tishman curse." And the other woman says, "What's the Tishman curse?" She says, "Mr. Tishman." So in the same way, YouTube's a wonderful thing because we can hear sometimes great 78 transfers that for whatever reason won't get onto a CD or won't be issued. Some collector somewhere, has taken the time to put the beautiful 78 also on archive.org. There's one person, I don't know who did it, but there's one, whole series of 78s where they would record the 178 with like 10 different styli.
Right.
And then the guy will pick the one that he think is best. I say the guy, it could be a woman, the person. But it is kind of a mixed blessing. And I'll leave it there because that's a whole other conversation. Let's go to the fourth title. Changes. Now this is interesting. They didn't record this until 1937. The great band with Harry James and Jess Stacy and Vito Musso and all that kind of stuff. But here we are, the first version that we have. Here it's called Beautiful Changes as opposed to Changes. It's a tune that Paul Whiteman made a record of, correct?
That's correct.
Right, with Bix and Tram and all those people. And here is a Fletcher Henderson arrangement. It's kind of funny, Nick. I mean, you'll dig this as will all the musicians. This is a tune about somebody who plays beautiful chord changes, and the lyrics are, now he goes to C, now he goes to D, and if I'm not mistaken, the lyrics actually do track the actual harmony of the song, which is very unusual. So many times, you don't get that. But there's no vocal here. Here we go. All right. Wow, I mean that's Fletcher Henderson's Ville, Benny Goodman's Ville. That's just a classic recording. And so interesting to, to compare it with the famous Victor record from 2 years later. They're still feeling their way into it, but so much to talk about. Short little tenor bits there by Dick Clark, which is why Vito Musso plays them on the last record, because they were in that chair as opposed to the Art Rollini chair. Pee Wee Irwin on the trumpet, the great saxophone section. So interesting to hear an unremarked thing for the most part about it. Here we hear Toots Mondello showing that all these charts had been in the band's book long before they were recording, and that Jaime Schertzer and the rest of them got to hear how Toots interpreted them. And then Jaime eventually chose a totally different Zen approach to lead alto, very different than Toots's, but very interesting. But let's just start with Harry Goodman, because do I hear slap bass in there? If I don't hear slap bass, and I hear some flopping sound in there during like Benny's chorus, do you guys hear any like or is it just that I need new batteries in my headphone?
You know what I thought I heard was some extra syncopation in the rhythm guitar at times, as well as some really interesting rhythmic accents from Gene. I didn't hear slapping, but there's that kind of effect that you get when the bass hits one beat, the drums hit another beat, and the guitars, and they're all working in this kind of chain reaction of how the beat's being laid out. And I kept on hearing the same thing, and I think partly it was a lot more syncopation from Roos, and Gene just playing a lot of really interesting rhythmic figures.
Yeah. Hal?
Gene was putting in those rim shots not just as every second and fourth beat. He was putting them in odd places, and along with Roos playing that syncopation, I think that really gave it a texture that no other bands were playing at that time. He did that kind of oddball rim shot with Red Nichols too, a few years before that, and where you'd expect somebody to play, he wouldn't. He'd play it on the third beat or the first beat sometimes, and it just shifts everything around in the rhythm section. But it's a marvelous sound. I wonder something other than the rhythm section, though. I think that may be Nate Casebeer on trumpet. Because of the phrasing.
Yes, it sounds like the last roundup and the Gene Krupa and the Chicagoan state.
Right.
Yes.
He was from the Southwest. He was from Lawrence, Kansas, just outside Kansas City. And I had a talk one time with Bob Helm, the San Francisco clarinetist who played with Lou Waters and Turk Murphy. He played with Benny Strickler, another Southwestern trumpeter from Arkansas, who played with Artie Shaw, Ben Pollock, Joe Venuti, Bob Wills. He was in the Texas Playboys during World War II, and then went west and finished out playing with Lou Waters before he was taken by tuberculosis. But I was talking with Bob about the transcriptions of Benny with the Waters band and that very interesting beat that he played. And Bob Helm said, yes, I believe that's a Southwestern thing. And I've written about this, like from Lamar Wright with Benny Moten's band to Yank Lawson and Nate Casebeer and Benny. They're all from Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma. Danny Alguire, who also played with Bob Wills' band and later with the Firehouse Five, they all played with a little hitch in their beat. And that's one way I tell Nate when I hear him, as opposed to Pee Wee Irwin, who just belted it out like Bunny Berrigan.
Where did you write about these things? I would love to read it.
I'll send it to you.
You mean privately, or for issue, or for your friends, or
for a book, an upcoming book?
Oh, okay. All right, good. Because Nate Casebeer, Nate Casebeer is playing on that Gene Krupa date. The last roundup in particularly, the out chorus on that record. But man, he's just so brilliant. I mean, what a fascinating session. Israel Crosby meets the Goodmanites,
Right.
and Benny is a sideman.
Yeah.
You know, we'll have to listen to that session when we get there.
Okay.
But anyway, man, you said so many interesting. Both of you. So okay, so you know, and it's funny because it wasn't that I heard a slap bass, but I heard something happening down in there that I couldn't figure out what it was, and now you explained it. One thing that's interesting is that Gene's playing, and this is where I think you'll tell me, you know, maybe this is something he got from Webb, although we don't know, but whereas like Sammy Weiss, just using him as a typical wonderful drummer of the era, they had these fills that they put in on the seventh and eighth measure, whatever, you know, blah, 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 and they did it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it works. It's good. Gene was always like playing the arrangement and looked as though that like, and he wasn't just underlying, oh, the trumpet hits. In fact, he doesn't make most of the trumpet hits or the sax hits. He makes his own hits. And so
That's right.
he's in there orchestrating. And one thing I'm learning from your comments here, both of you, is that the rhythm section, it's not like now we think of the piano players comping.
Mm-hmm.
But all four of these guys, and I mean, actually not that much from the piano right now, that'll come later. But Goodman, Roos, and Krupa are like comping to the arrangement all the time, adding their own things. And again, that's like a concept that's long lost, I think. People think that the rhythm guitar is this and the bass is this, you know. And absolutely fascinating.
It's a difficult art, also playing big band drums when you're a small band drummer, because you tend to put in accents and fills that step on somebody else. If I put in what I feel at a certain point, it may step on a trumpet hit out of an arrangement. And Gene avoided all of that. Anything that he added on his own gave weight to the rhythm section, but it didn't step on anybody or get in the way. Like hitting two rim shots, da-da, instead of just one. It's interesting and it grabs your attention just for a minute, but it doesn't take away from the arrangement in general.
Yeah, true. Well, listen, we have worked our way through a whopping 4 of the 51 titles on this one record date, so we have a lot of work ahead of us. Thanks, Hal. Thanks, Nick. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all next time as we continue through the Rhythm Makers. Thanks. Bye-bye.